and Murtagh. She'll speak about Elizabeth Butler, who later became the Countess of Desmond and Lady Dingwall. Anne will explore Elizabeth's background, the world she lived in, the extraordinary events in her life, and some interesting snippets she's looking forward to sharing. Anne represents CAS in the Kilkenny Public Participation Network. She's also a team member of the subcommittee currently organising a local history competition for primary schools. Anne is a full-time writer and has published 3 historical novels for children, and is now working on a story for adults inspired by the events in Elizabeth Butler's life, and is also a recipient of the Agility Award from the Arts Council and a mentorship from the Irish Writers' Centre to write this story on Elizabeth.
Thank you very much for asking me to give this talk, because I'm very interested in this lady and I feel she's been in the shadows for a long time. I think sandwiched really between her father, Black Tom, and her daughter, the first Countess of Ormond, or the first Duchess of Ormond, I should say. So I'm going to bring Elizabeth out of the shadows tonight and talk a little bit about her. And as we said in the introduction, I'm going to look at her family background, the world she lived in, an account of her life, and I'm going to weave interesting little snippets into my presentation, just snippets that I found interesting in the research that I think you'll find interesting too. So we'll start with her background. She was Thomas Butler's daughter, the 10th Earl of Ormond, an Anglo-Irish aristocrat, we could say, and her mother was Elizabeth Sheffield. Now, I wasn't able to get an image of Elizabeth, and just as you had the problems with the Lucys, Elizabeth is my problem. They're all Elizabeths, you know. And just in terms of, you know, who she's connected to, especially to the royal family, I decided I'd apply the grandfather rule. So how is Elizabeth Butler connected to Anne Boleyn? On her father's side, her grandfather, James Butler, was the 4th cousin of Anne Boleyn. Now, if anyone is familiar with this story, he was actually her intended at one stage. That was before she had bigger fish to fry, of course, in the English court. And her engagement would have been spoken a lot about in court before she became interested, or before Henry VIII became interested in her. But that was the connection there, which is quite far out, but still counted for a lot at the time. And then on her mother's side, she was more closely related to Anne Boleyn, in that her mother, Douglas Sheffield, who was Douglas Howard from the famous Howard family, she was a first cousin of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. You know, so I just thought that was an interesting start, that, you know, she's related to Queen Elizabeth on both sides, you know. And that's one thing that came up through my research, was that you have such a small group of people intermarrying all the time. It's amazing, oh gosh, look at who she's married to, or look at who he's married to. Same with the Irish, actually, as we'll see later on. So I just want to give a little bit of background to Thomas Butler, because it has pertinent repercussions for Elizabeth's life, obviously. And he was fostered at a young age by the O'Moores in County Laois. Now, not only was he fostered by this family, he was actually related to them. And in this John Derrick image of Ireland from 1581, that's actually Rory O'More that's in that picture. And he's actually a second cousin of Elizabeth that we're talking about. And when Elizabeth's father, Black Tom, was fostered with this family, that's where he became familiar with the Irish language. And I think it's, you know, an interesting irony later on that he was such an Anglophobe, you know, that he had so many kind of Irish characteristics, including being fluent in Irish. And it was from that time. And then when he was 13, he was dispatched over to the court in England. James, his father, was spending a lot of time over there. And he was at school with Edward VI, who reigned shortly, of course, after his father. And Henry VIII was still alive for 2 of the years that Thomas was over there. So I saw in some of the history books that this was the time they felt he was being radicalised as an Englishman. So I just thought I'd share that little term with you. Then in 1854, age 23, he came back to Ireland. And it was during that time, before he came back, that he became very close to Elizabeth. Now, she was waiting in the wings, and think of all the trauma that she was going through. Her mother was beheaded. She had a whole series of stepmothers. I think she was declared illegitimate. You know, so she was going through quite a traumatic time, and he was over in England at the same time. Like, they were cousins, but they actually became good friends as well. And that bond really lasted throughout both their lives. They remained close. And because of that closeness, he was awarded honours such as being Lord Treasurer of Ireland, Lord Admiral of Ireland, Lord General of the Irish Army, and a member of the Irish Privy Council. And I've got the pound notes up there to remind me to tell you that in the British Isles, the Butlers were actually in the top 10 wealthiest families. So they were hugely wealthy. I think David Edwards says in his book that 1/3 of the available land in Kilkenny actually belonged to the Butlers. You know, so they were very, very well off. Age 29, he married Elizabeth Berkeley. And in age 51, he married Elizabeth Sheffield. Now, the first marriage didn't work out and they separated. And so he didn't have family really till he was in his 50s, you know, mature man. And he had James, born in 1583, and our Elizabeth, born in 1585, and then a little baby that died soon after, Thomas, in the late 1580s. So our Elizabeth then would have started life in Cannon Row in London. And I've kind of shown it there. It was before there was a lot of reclamation along the Thames at this stage, so it was pre the reclamation. And just to give you a modern version, that's where they lived. And you can see it's close to the heart of what was going on, right beside Westminster, you know. So that's where she was, where they were living. But unfortunately, in 1590, James, the oldest of the family, he was only 6½, died. And it was a terrible tragedy, and especially for Thomas Butler, the father, because the whole estates had to go to the next male heir. And there, you know, his little boy was gone. And he was buried in Westminster Abbey, little James was, because of the Queen's special relationship with Black Tom. She gave him that honour. And I actually visited the little chapel in Westminster Abbey where he was buried, the Chapel of St. Paul's. So in 1593, Thomas Butler, aged 62, returned to Ireland. And I thought at this point we might just broaden the lens a little bit and just look at the world that Elizabeth lived in. For example, food was very much dictated by the humours. That was the way they viewed health. You know, that you were phlegmatic or you're sanguine. There were 4 different things that people believed dominated your body. And for example, if you were phlegmatic, you had to avoid watery foods such as fish and waterfowl. So this was really for the wealthy people. Poor people got whatever they could get their hands on to eat. But for wealthy people, this kind of science dictated what they chose to eat. And meat was a big thing, especially for the wealthy people. It was a status food. And 75% of the diet of wealthy people actually was meat, all different kinds of meat. And sugar was another important food at the time, very much a status food. It was very, very expensive. And they had all sorts of ideas about sugar. First of all, that it helped you digest your food. So after your dinner, you would have something sweet to help you digest your food. Does that sound familiar? That's the whole thing. That's how dessert actually evolved. Then they thought it was medicinal. The lozenges that you could have for colds, they would have evolved around that time. Preservative, like for fruits, to make jams and, you know, to preserve. So it became useful for that. The confectionery sculpture, we've often seen them on television for this period, you know, palaces and, you know, statues all done in these beautiful sugar sculptures. And The fact that they were delivered to your house in these kind of loaves, there was quite a ritual of breaking down the sugar to use it. So there were certain instruments that were available for this. And it became very much the domain of the women in the household. Hence, I'm bringing it in tonight. And so it was, you know, in the Kilkenny Castle, no doubt, the women had charge of the sugar. So I thought this was a relevant thing to include. But of course, the whole sugar and the urge for sugar and the craze that it created propelled the slave trade as well. And that was a consequence of that. And just a few interesting points about sitting at table. You know, we have this idea that, you know, the Elizabethans were kind of dirty and, you know, didn't really wash themselves, but they actually were quite clean people. And when you sat down at a table, the first thing you did was you got your ewer and your basin and washed your hands before you ate. And this other implement here is called the standing salt, and that was put in front of the most important person at the table. And based on who was sitting to the right of that person, you were ranked in importance, you know. So one thing I did learn as well from all of this research was that status, you know, in every shape or form, it was really obvious. From the clothes you wore, to the food you ate, to where you lived, you know, just, it was, you know, huge. It dictated. And of course, at the time, we didn't have knives and forks. You had a pricker and a knife and spoon. So forks came later. And I just thought I'd have a little sneaky look at the clothes. And this is Lady Frances Howard Fitzgerald, a first cousin of Elizabeth's mother, who married Henry Fitzgerald, the 12th Earl of Kildare. And you can see her beautiful collar. This was known as a Medici collar from Marie de Medici, who brought it from Italy to France during this century. And the lace that it stood up with was held up with either very stiff starch or little wires. You know, so it was quite a thing to wear one of these things. And knot gardens were the real fashionable garden at the time. And they were thought to have evolved from embroidery patterns. So the type of plants you'd have would be marjoram, thyme, hyssop, lemon balm and lavender, quite a strong emphasis on scent. And, you know, the ladies and men would walk around. It was a great place for meditating and getting exercise. And some very elaborate knot gardens, such as the garden in Kenilworth Castle, belonging to Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's favourite. Now, I can't say with any certainty that there were any gardens like this in Kilkenny at the time. I think really it was the first Duke that gardens really evolved in a serious way around the castle. But these are the type of gardens Elizabeth would have seen in other places. And also, speaking of gardens still, the whole world was opening up in terms of people travelling and plants coming back. And these were arrivals that came during the 16th century. Crocuses, grape hyacinths, tulips, and laburnum, just a few that came at the time. The tulip craze didn't happen until, I think, the early 17th century. But I have the 600 down there to remind me to tell you that in Elizabeth's reign, 600 plants were added to the already known list. And some of these would have come from faraway countries like the Americas, you know, the Far East. But some would actually have been found in England itself, in more remote places. People were travelling more and discovering more, and they made their ways into the gardens. And I'm just saying that we're so lucky to have our lovely Rothaus garden. And if anyone's interested in Tudor gardens, we have it right here. And Anna Carolina Distel has some nice talks on Tudor plants on our website. And another pastime that men and women were very keen on was falconry and hawking. And as I have it up there, that hunting was for relaxation and pleasure. Now, the use of hawks and falcons originally was actually to get food for families, but eventually it became a kind of prestige for the aristocracy, for the well-off people, and to actually train a wild bird like this took patience and intelligence. And, you know, it was a great reflection on people to be able to do this. They saw that as, you know, It was quite the thing to have a bird of prey on your arm with your leather glove on, of course. And I just thought this was interesting, that the types of sayings that have come from this time, to be hoodwinked, when the hood was put over the bird to remove distraction. And, we use that today. Wrapped around your little finger with the jesses, when you put them, the leather strings that you attach to the birds, when they're put around your finger, that's wrapped around your little finger. And if it was under your thumb, you're really controlling that bird. And fed up, when the birds would be overfed or drank too much, they wouldn't be good for anything. So that was the expression, they were fed up, So Elizabeth's mother sent a goshawk to Sir Robert Cecil over in the court in 1598. And I just thought that was worth recording. So Elizabeth, I can't say with certainty that she did have goshawks or falcons, but the possibility is that she did have something to do with them. And goshawks, by the way, were particularly prized birds in England and were quite scarce. So you would see from time to time they would be sent over as gifts to the royal court. And I just wanted to mention that Anne Boleyn's carved falcons, they were all over Hampton Court Palace when she was, in her heyday, and they were removed afterwards. But that was the falcon crest from the Ormond family. The falcon came from there, so I just thought it was worth mentioning. So we're coming down to more specific information now about Elizabeth's homes, particularly Kilkenny Castle and Ormond Castle. Now, Ormond Castle was built by her father in the 1560s, and it would seem that that was really the place for holidays, for leisure, and Kilkenny Castle was more the official home. And this mansion was built by Thomas Butler before 1580. And it was largely demolished, I think, during the work that was done on the castle in the 19th century. So remodelled, and a lot of it moved. But up on I've demilitarised there to remind me to tell you that houses were changing at the time. They weren't these big fortified places. They were becoming demilitarised, and more like houses that we're familiar with today. So I think this is a very exciting time that so many things were changing: food, clothes, houses, gardens. It was a really an interesting time to look at. And upstairs on this top floor here, there was a long gallery. I know it's in another wing now today, but that was the long gallery in Elizabeth's day. And to get some idea what it might have looked like, I just am using this photograph of the long gallery in Ormond Castle in Carrick-on-Suir, the other castle that the Butlers used. And that was used for exercise and, for special events, obviously, as well. But at times when the weather was very bad and people couldn't walk in the gardens, they would walk up and down their long galleries. And it was a great place, of course, to show off your ancestors and have your crest up and, really state your importance and remind the visitors, how big you are and how important you are. And I just took this from Fergal Donoghue's thesis to show what the layout was at the time. You can see that the castle entrance was facing the castle park. And there was Boyce's Lane possibly was here where the Rose Garden crosses today. And all of that, of course, was remodelled by the first Duke when he returned from Europe. But in Elizabeth's day, this is the setup. And I just was interested in the type of, entertainment she would have seen in the castle. Blind Cruse. George Cruse was a famous blind harper that played in the castle at the time. He was very well known. He actually travelled to London and played there as well. And it was also well known that Black Tom employed poets to come to Kilkenny Castle and recite poetry, Irish and English. And I found this piece on Trenchmore. It's a type of dance, and of course I was thinking about Elizabeth, and dancing was so popular at the time, and young girls loved to do that. And I have the smiley up here because I just was so interested in long ways for as many as will. So it's like the Rink of More. Did anyone see that documentary in the spring about Irish dancing? And they had this Rink of More, this long line of people on a field all dancing. And I think the Trenchmore was a dance like that. And if anyone wants to look it up on the internet, Sean Donnelly has written a piece about it. And it was known as an English country dance. But when Sean actually looked at it, he actually did research into, possibly where the name came from. And he thinks it originally came from Kilkenny, from the townland Trenchmore, which I show here on the map. And he maintains that he actually has a little excerpt of the Trenchmore being done during King Edward's time, that short time that he was on the throne, and that it was a group of Irish people that were doing it. But it's used in several sources after that, and it's such a lively dance. It's actually used sometimes. Oh, they were doing a Trenchmore, like they were really lively. It's even used like that. And David Edwards, in his essay in the Magnates and Merchants of Kilkenny, he's referred to a sizable London Irish community. So I felt that kind of substantiated what the other man was saying, and I thought that was an interesting. And anyone who's interested in this music, short commercial break. The Earls of Ormond, the music in Kilkenny, on the 17th of November, they're playing in the Parade Tower. So music that would have been played at the time, that all those different musicians will be playing. Another thing I was very interested in, that wolves were still around Kilkenny at the time, and Elizabeth might have heard those, I'm sure she did. And in the list of skins that were available in the markets, wolf skins were among them. And that's going to bring me very nicely into Hugh O'Neill, because he was often referred to as a wolf. And think of what was going on in Ireland at the time, the 9 Years' War. And I've just got this quote for Hugh O'Neill: for him to be free of English power, everyone has to be free of English power. So he started off with the local dispute up in Ulster, but he realised that to really maintain the type of lifestyle that he wanted, he had to, everyone had to get rid of the English. It wasn't just getting rid of the local English. And he built up a whole set of alliances or confederates throughout the country during the 9 Years' War, helped by Spain, of course. And the term wolf was used for him, and often used for native Irish people as well. These cunning people living in the woods like wolves. It was a derogatory word that was used. And he was the bane of the Crown forces. He had such incredible successes, up to about 1600 in particular. And he was on the crest of a wave, and he almost bankrupted England with the cost of, trying to overcome. And just looking at the allies locally for Hugh O'Neill, James and Pierce Butler from Clough-Grennan in County Carlow, and how they're related to Elizabeth, I have on the other column, they're cousins. Edmund Butler from the Mountgarrett Butlers out in Ballyragget, and Richard Butler was his son, and the McGillifodricks from Gortna Clay, and Oney MacRory O'More from County Laois. He's really the big one, that I'm interested in. But we mentioned earlier on about all the intermarriages of the royal family and the aristocratic families. But in the Irish families, the same thing happened. James Butler was actually married to a sister of Oney MacRory O'More's at one stage. And then when he died, she married another Irish confederate, Richard Terrell. Hugh O'Neill's daughter was married to Richard Butler, one of the Mountgarrett Butlers. And Oney MacRory O'More, we'll see in a minute actually more about him. He was just a firebrand, is the way I would describe him, living in County Laois. But he was very young. He witnessed his mother being beheaded by the Crown forces. And he was actually Fiach McHugh O'Byrne's nephew. Fiach McHugh has given the word. That's our Fiach McHugh now. So Oni's mother was an O'Byrne, and when she met her awful end, he was actually adopted by his uncle, himself and Doireann, his sister. And so he was really trained to be a rebel right from the start. And in the Midlands, where there were 2 plantations in Laois and Offaly, and down in Munster, when things started going awry, he was in there and ready and stirring trouble. He was a very close ally of O'Neill's, and, really problematic. And he was young, he was only in his early 20s. But that's Oni MacRory O'More. And I said about the English almost being bankrupt, and one of the reasons was the Earl of Essex came over, and he was an absolute disaster as a military leader and had a huge army that cost a packet, and to no avail. He wasn't able to, make any really serious inroads as far as O'Neill was concerned. But the reason I have him here is because he visited Kilkenny on the 20th of May 1599, and I'm just thinking, this dashing courtier, what did Elizabeth think of him, when he visited the town? So he actually had to go back. Well, he left and unofficially and got into trouble over that, the Earl of Essex, and Mountjoy replaced him. Charles Blunt is his name, but I'm going to refer to him by his name, Lord Mountjoy. He became the Lord Deputy of Ireland. And in 1600, Thomas Butler, Donogh O'Brien, his cousin who lived in Bunratty Castle, he was the Earl of Ormond, and Sir George Carew, who had been just appointed President of Munster. The 3 of them had visited Mountjoy, and they were back in Kilkenny. And this was the incident that got me interested in Elizabeth in the first instance. And Oni MacRory O'More, that we met a few minutes ago, he contacted Thomas Butler. Now, remember, they were related, and he was fostered with a few generations back, Thomas was. He contacted Thomas and wanted to have a parley with them, and to, about obviously making peace. And Thomas Butler fell for it, and probably wanted it very badly, and, thought it was genuine. And he went, you can see where, this is Seven Crossroads, if anyone knows that area. And so, Ballyragget, and there's where they met. But it was actually a hoax. And I think this picture was drawn maybe 100 years afterwards. But here's Thomas on a horse being pulled off it. And this is Father James Archer. He was one of the families from Kilkenny, and educated in Louvain and Salamanca, trained as a Jesuit. And that was happening quite a lot with different, the families in Kilkenny. Anybody who wanted to be a priest, that's where they had to go abroad to be trained. But he was with O'Neill, James Archer. At this stage, Hugh O'Neill was really pushing the Catholic agenda, really to hoping to get the Old English on board. And James Archer, was there, his confessor, and very much on his side. And it was well known that Thomas Butler disliked this James Archer, and, was very upset when he saw him at the party. And so, what was the reason for, I just want to say that he was taken then. Thomas Butler was actually kidnapped by the O'Moores. And what was the reason for that? Well, they thought that with all the successes that they might persuade Thomas Butler to join the Irish side. And there were a couple of priests, when he went, you will see where he was taken captive in a minute, there were a couple of Jesuits on his case all the time. They actually slept in the same room, trying to persuade him to become Catholic. It would have been a great coup for the Irish side if this happened. And David Edwards suggests in the book we just referred to a minute ago that it was to remove Thomas from the scene. He was an important mover and shaker in the whole pro-Crown side, and that by removing him, would make things easier for the rebels. But either way, whatever happened, Oni MacRory O'More was going to look for concessions, and I think that was a powerful kind of motivating thing as well, that he would get some concessions to actually release Black Tom. So the first place he was brought actually into woods first, and kind of lived rough for a few days, and then he was brought to Gorton Clay Castle, which was a McGillipodrick stronghold. And there's where it is in terms of, it's on the, the Laois Carl border, yeah. And there was huge concern, once this happened and news broke, there was huge concern about Elizabeth, our Elizabeth, because for two reasons. One was that there was a terrible fear that some of the native Irish would come in and kidnap her and make them marry some of the, the Irish men. That would really be awful as far as the English were concerned. And the other thing it's interesting was that they were afraid that Thomas would be actually pressurised into agreeing to have his daughter marry some of the Irish chieftains in order to be released. So they were very concerned about her and very protective of her. They wanted to bring her up to Dublin first. Lord Mountjoy said, we'll bring her up and we'll protect her in Dublin. But her mother was very, very ill at the time, and she didn't want to separate from her mother. And I think the two of them took quite a pragmatic stance in all of this and decided that to stay put, I should say, was the best thing to do, because if they left, it would leave the place vulnerable to some of the other butlers to come in and take over the place. They felt that if they moved, all the soldiers, would move with them. There wouldn't be enough people to guard the castle. There wouldn't be enough soldiers to guard the castle. So, they were protecting their own interests by staying as much as anything else, I do believe. And Queen Elizabeth wrote to the mother, and Elizabeth's mother, and said, "I'm terrible. This is terrible what's happened." And Robert Cecil, Secretary of State, they were all really in on it. It would look very bad for the crown if anything had happened to Elizabeth. And Christopher St. Lawrence from Howth Castle, if anyone knows the story about Gráinne Whale, was supposed to have kidnapped him as a child. I don't know, didn't go into it, sorry, don't know whether that's true. But anyway, he's the person that is in that story. He was sent to the castle to be in charge of the soldiers. And an older man, George Boucher, who's actually related to Elizabeth, he was married to Elizabeth's grandaunt, the granny sister. So they deliberately chose him because of that family connection. And the two of them were sent to, to stay, to look after the military side and family side. And Thomas was moved to Ballybrittis in May, belonged to Terence O'Dempsey. So he still was in custody. And then that shows where it is now. So you can see in relation to Portlaoise where it is, between Portlaoise and Monasterevin. And then in June 1600, Thomas was released. And that was because they paid over £3,000. Local people collected it and paid it over. And 12 local men gave their names as possible hostages if the money wasn't handed over. So it shows that, Thomas Butler was very well got really locally. And now I'm going to just look at the next part in relation to Elizabeth was the succession. Because there was no son, remember what happened, James died and Elizabeth was the only legal heir alive, but she couldn't inherit the title and the lands because she was a girl. So Thomas had to nominate somebody. Now, you're going to be shocked by this. The Clough-Grennan Butlers were the next in line. There were 6 boys in Black Tom's. He had 5 siblings, and Edmund was next. And so his sons, Edmund's sons, were the 2 next in line. But because they became rebels in 1596, and they were captured, and they actually escaped, and Black Tom's spy network found out where they were going. He caught James first and had him executed. And then a couple of months later, Pierce was crossing the Shannon and some of Black Tom's men got him, brought him back to Thurles and beheaded him. So, we're talking about bloody times and, awful things within families. So the two of those, first of all, they couldn't be nominated as an heir to Black Tom because before this, in 1596, because they were rebels. But then, obviously, look what happened. But they had a younger brother called Theobald. He was the youngest son of the family. That's why I have youngest son there. And so Black Tom decided he would nominate Theobald as his heir. He was too young to be involved in any of the rebellions, and he felt, he could control this young boy. And not only that, he decided that he would marry his daughter. So at age 11, this marriage was arranged for Elizabeth. And, you know, I remember when I came across this first about, I say probably 10 years ago now or even more, I thought, you know, he was looking out for his daughter. No, sorry, he wasn't. He was concerned about the land and it all staying in one, you know, unit and passing it on. That's really what he was concerned about, you know. And in order to have Theobald safe, I suppose physically safe, and also to make sure he didn't join any rebellion, he had him brought up to Dublin Castle and imprisoned. Now, I think it wasn't severe. It was, you know, from reading between the lines, but still that controlling thing, you know, it didn't augur well. So later in 1600, Elizabeth's mother dies, and there's a very interesting account of her funeral in St. Canice's Cathedral and all the pomp and circumstance surrounding that. Elizabeth goes to England, accompanied by George Boucher, so he's in the story again, going with her to England. Why does she have to go to the court? Well, in the old days, if you were marrying your cousin, you went to the Pope for dispensation. Thank you, dispensation. But of course, after the Reformation, that no longer applied. So she was going to Elizabeth for dispensation. And she had to kind of put her case across to make a good impression on the Queen to allow her to marry her first cousin. So Gilbert Talbot of Shrewsbury, who was actually the wealthiest man in England at the time, Thomas got him to look after Elizabeth, and he did all the introducing. And of course, she had her grandmother in court as well. It was an interesting time for her. Ormond doesn't waste any time. Black Tom, he marries again, Helen Barry, 31, in June 1601. Now, they don't have any children. I'd say that was the last hurrah, hoping the son would come along. But Elizabeth Butler is presented at court in 1602 to Queen Elizabeth. And the Queen allows the cousins to marry. Now, that's not them. I just took that image from the internet. In 1603. And Elizabeth is endowed with an estate worth £800 per annum. Now, it was Gilbert Talbot that suggested that to Black Tom, to do that. And that was not available to her until her father died. And Theobald was made Lord Tullophalem in 1603. And they had to live on an allowance of £500, which was, you know, very little for such a wealthy family. He was just so mean, Thomas Butler. He was so tight and so controlling. And actually, just to say that he was so controlling that he didn't even allow them to have their own house. He insisted that they lived with them in Carrick, I'm sure, you know. It was, and he didn't trust Theobald. He obviously didn't like him. He gave out all the time about the servants he employed. And, you know, there's strong evidence to suggest that Theobald actually was violent towards Elizabeth because of it. It was not, you know, a happy marriage. So I'd say Theobald couldn't wait till Black Tom popped his clogs. But what do you know? He actually died himself in 1613, and Black Tom was still alive. And of course, he died childless. So poor Elizabeth was back square one. And she was, I should have said, sorry, that in August 1613, Black Tom actually threw the pair of them out. He had such a row with Theobald. He threw them out. So I'd say they went back to Tullophalem. And then when he died, Black Tom sent for Elizabeth to Carrick. And she had to hear the news that Thomas Butler's was nominating a new heir, Walter of the Beads. So his father John, Walter's father John, was the Butlers of Kilcosh, and he was next in line. And Walter was, because of his religious tendencies, that was his nickname, Walter of the Beads. So anyway, Theobald, that time when Theobald and Elizabeth had to live on so little, he had to borrow money all the time to, you know, keep afloat. And he had mounted debts, you know, by the time he died. And Walter said to Black Tom, well, look, I don't want to pay for all this, you know, debts of your daughter's first husband, you know, could you reduce her allowance? And Black Tom agreed to it. So now she had to live on £300. And so this is a case of sisters doing it for themselves, 16th century or 17th century, I should say, because she started sending petitions to Dublin and London during the spring and summer of 1614. She just totally lost confidence in her father, to help her, because it was obvious he was freezing her out. So she got an interesting ear, and that was James VI and the First. James VI of Scotland. Now, I was in Scotland last summer, and they insist on this, James VI and James I. And he heard of her plight and decided to take it on board. And this is kind of Tinder style at the time. He sent over a prospective husband to Elizabeth with a royal letter of recommendation. Now, it wasn't just that, it really was a royal command. And who was this guy? Richard Preston, Lord Dingwall. He was one time ambassador to Venice, and he was in his mid-40s. I'm going to have to stop and ask here. Did anyone watch this, Mary and George? Yeah, Mary and George. Okay, so this is my intro. For people who didn't watch it, George Villiers was one of the many lovers of the bisexual James VI, James I. And Mary was his mother, and she really kind of groomed him, I could say, to take on the king. And especially when the court moved to England, mostly it was Scottish men that came down with the king, but she got him to throw his cap at him, and it worked. And so he was very much the favourite at the time. But our Richard Preston was a former lover of the king, an earlier lover, and he had the distinction of staying in the king's good books when the affair finished. So that's where he would have got the title Lord Dingwall. It was, one of those special favours that was shown to him. But this was the king's way of, I suppose, rewarding Richard in some ways, because, and also I'll have to say that Richard owed the king a lot of money, and I've got a feeling that this had something to do with getting involved with the Ormond case, that, maybe the king could get some of that money back. But anyway, the marriage takes place in October, and Thomas Butler is against it. And the reason why I have the picture up there is that just the irony of it, like all along, Black Tom had the ear of the Queen of England, and, she was very compliant in things that he wanted. And now he was being told that he had to do something by the king, and he had no choice, and he really didn't want to do it, to agree to the marriage. And so he died on the 22nd of November of that year, 1614. So Elizabeth challenges the will then. And of course, her access to the court made a huge difference. I'm talking about the royal court now, as opposed to the court of law. That had made a huge difference to her case. Unlike Walter Butler, who she was coming up against, because he was being left everything practically. Now, she did have some allowances, but in comparison to what she could have got, it was, very meagre. And Walter was at a far greater disadvantage for a few different reasons. Arthur Chichester was the man who came after Mountjoy in Dublin. He was the Lord Lieutenant. And basically, when Walter went up to Dublin to put his case against the Prestons, that, he wanted to keep his land and all of that, Arthur Chichester would actually write to the Prestons and let them know, well, he's just been here, He kept them informed all the time about what was happening. And also George Villiers, the king's lover, he became friendly with Richard Preston as well, and he backed him and had the ear of the king at the time. So, he was another kind of powerful force. And the fact that Walter was Catholic did not go down well in the court, because they didn't want a wealthy Catholic magnate, in Ireland. That was the last thing they wanted. So it was all kind of stacking against Walter. So the dispute escalates, and a daughter is born, Elizabeth Preston, another Elizabeth, in 1615 to Elizabeth. And then in December 1617, the king decides that it's going on too much in court. He was going to intervene, and he said that the parties involved were required to attend and declare that they were willing to obey and perform whatever he decided. So this was unusual, and some of the judges were not happy about this, because it was, contrary to the law. But he was a real believer in the divine right of kings, if ever. And the 3rd of October, King decides in Elizabeth's favour, and Walter refuses to accept the royal settlement. Now, that was very ill-advised, but he ended up in prison because of that. James did not take that kindly. And Richard Preston was made the Earl of Desmond, getting an old title that had died out. And Elizabeth and Richard Preston, when they went to actually go and claim some of the properties, they found that they actually legally couldn't own them. And that was due to the incompetence of some government officials. Like 7 out of the 10 manors that they were supposed to get, they couldn't own them. And in the meantime, Walter's son Thomas drowns at sea. And that was a real tragedy for him, because his son was a great advocate for him. Walter had a large family that he was trying to support, and Thomas had a family that he was trying to support as well. So that, it was a double tragedy. And then the fact that the king took Thomas's son and made James and made him a ward of court was another blow to Walter, especially when he went to the Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury. Walter being so religious and all of that, it was another blow. So things were really moving on. Walter decides to accept the king's decision in 1625, but he actually dies that year, the king himself. And Walter is temporarily released from prison, and he's getting ready to go over to Ireland in 1628. But things really take an unusual turn. Elizabeth is on her way over to Ireland that time as well, and going through Wales, she becomes suddenly ill and dies. And Richard Preston is on his way over to her funeral, and he drowns at sea. You couldn't make this up, could you? So Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 17th of March 1629. No, actually, she must have been buried in Wales first and then reburied. But she is buried in that little chapel, St. Paul's Chapel. And I visited in January, and I was amazed to find out, again, the connections. Elizabeth and her brother James are buried there. Lord Mountjoy is buried there. What's the chances? George Boucher's great-grandfather. And Elizabeth Berkeley, Thomas Butler's first wife, they're all buried in that little chapel in Westminster Abbey. And their daughter, 1629, Walter pressed for the marriage of his grandson James to the Prestons' daughter Elizabeth. And there we have the first Duke and Duchess of Ormond. She was 14 at the time she got married, but anyway. And that's the end of my story, and thank you very much.